Okay, so I just wanted to confirm, I thought I heard that the large growth rate that the ports have been experiencing is mostly pandemic driven because it's an odd situation and it's probably not sustainable. We'd probably go back to something more in line with whatever quote unquote normal growth is. So can I just get that confirmed?
Ori, do you want to try it first?
Apologies, that's not something that we directly addressed in the presentation or staff report, but I think the port could probably speak best to COVID-related numbers. And in terms of the forecast, we're looking at the long range.
All right, Danny, it's back to you.
Sorry.
We have an anomalous situation where LA and Long Beach is experiencing a big surge in volume. Their volume is increasing, and part of their congestion problem is that. At the Port of Oakland, unfortunately for us, we are not seeing a surge. Our volume is decreasing, and we hope that's not the normal. We hope to go back to a normal growth pattern that we've seen before the pandemic, which is about, like I said, since 2005, a 0.5% growth every year. That's been our sort of average growth. And you're right, there's surges between certain years and certain times of the year, but essentially that has been our average growth from 2005. There's a variety of factors why our port's not growing as fast as LA and Long Beach. And even if, for example, we used to be the 4th most voluminous port in the country about 10 years ago. We've dropped from the 4th to about 9th and 10th today. There's various factors why that's happening, including the Panama Canal and all these macro level issues that's happening. So to your question, we expect, yes, to go back to our normal where our volume will not, instead of decreasing, start going up again, but we don't expect that volume to go up drastically, deviating from our normal pattern about 5 to 2% growth every year.
Thank you.
Before I go to the next commissioner, I want to take over an important procedural detail. I would ask for a motion to close the public hearing, allowing written comments until 5 p.m. tomorrow.
That's the motion you need. I'll make it.
Second. Commissioner Vasquez makes it, and I'm sorry, Commissioner Joya seconds. Peggy, I think we need a roll call on that. Pains me to say that, but do we? I think we do. No? You're right. Sorry. I get a little nervous because I don't really like roll call. Is there anybody opposed anywhere to closing the public hearing? Who's the commissioner?
Unmute yourself, please.
I see no hands and no unmuting. The public hearing is closed except to accept written comments until 5 p.m. tomorrow. Thank you very much. I will now recognize Commissioner Eklund.
Thank you very much, Chair Wasserman. So my question centers around slide 25 that Corey showed. I'm not sure I totally understand the new figures on the cargo forecast with the change in the acreage. And I will study that some more. And Corey, if I have some questions, I will definitely give you a call. But the question that I had is that, have we done a study if we felt that that was too tight of a estimate for 2050, that, well, maybe we should hold back the 10 acres that is part of the turning basin? So have we done a analysis of the cargo forecast if we held back the 10 acres that were proposed to be part of the turning basin, thinking that that additional acreage would give more of a cushion for the cargo forecast?
Thanks for your question, and apologies. I know that SDE site thing is a bit confusing, but do feel free to follow up with me. I'd be happy to answer questions. So in regards to the turning basin, because that was already on the radar as the cargo forecast was being developed, the forecast was developed basically operating under the assumption that those 10 acres would be used for the turning basin. And so Howard Terminal as a site is about 50 acres, but you'll see in the cargo forecast it's generally referenced as 40 acres or sometimes 38 acres. And that would depend on what type of cargo Howard Terminal might be handling. There's a couple of minor variations on things like electrification for a container port. But that was basically accounted for in the forecast. Am I gathering your question?
So
Yes.
if it was accounted for in the forecast, then does the commission have the authority to say, okay, we can take out 45 acres, minus the 10, assuming it's 55. I've heard different acreage, 50, 55 or whatever. So we pull out the 10 acres that is associated with the turning basin. That is in the reserve in the Oakland Athletics contract between the Port of Oakland and the Oakland Athletics, and only redesignate 40 of the acres, not the 50. Is that an option for the commission?
Commissioner Eklund, I think we're a little confused by your question because the application from the Oakland Athletics is to remove the port priority use area, I'm going to make this wrong, but the 50 acres for the port priority use area. And so the Oakland Athletics application is not to remove it for the turning basin, and it doesn't incorporate the turning basin in at all. That's a separate project that will come to the commission in the future, most likely. So I'm not quite sure.
But the Port of Oakland, apparently in the contract with the Oakland A's, has the 10 acres that's reserved that they can pull back if they're going to proceed with the turning basin. So
are you assuming that then the port priority use area has to be retained in order to facilitate the turning basin?
Yes.
I see. Okay. So removing the turning basin can proceed with or without the port priority use area. Okay. So the port priority use area doesn't need to be retained or protected in order to facilitate the turning basin. In fact, port priority use areas are there to protect shoreline area and not necessarily bay. And so removing the port priority use area cleans up the site to allow bay to sort of come into there so they can, open up the bay. Does that answer your question? I hope I'm understanding.
Yeah, you've answered it. Thank you. Okay. And I'll follow up with Corey on the other things that were on page 25 of the slideshow. Thank you.
Please do.
Recognize Commissioner Joya.
Thank you. And I do want to thank everybody involved, all the public that spoke. These are important issues, and to the staff. And I appreciate it. I think, folks have said, well, there's different information before us than the Seaport Advisory Committee. And that's because I think we're always open to have a full record. We're always open to get complete information. And I know the information that was presented to the Seaport Advisory Committee didn't have all the information that's been presented to us. And I don't know how that would have affected the vote. Maybe it would have, maybe it wouldn't, but it was a very close vote, 5-4-1. So, which really gets to the issue, though, of our role, because our role is even broader. The staff report says, and I want to just have staff explain this so we're familiar, makes reference to the fact that the Commission's role is broader than that of the Seaport Advisory Committee and looks at the totality of evidence before it in determining whether the deletion would detract from the regional capability to meet the projected growth in cargo. So can the staff just further explain that? So our role is to consider all the evidence, including the recommendation from the Seaport Advisory Committee, which again was based on a different set of information than what we're getting, but it's broader than that. So can you explain that for a bit? Somebody.
I think that's going to be a question for Michael or Greg.
Well, I guess I'll take it, John and Commissioner Joya. Yeah, I mean, I think the commission's role in this is to look at all the information you're getting, information from the public, information from, the staff, information from the Seaport Planning Advisory Committee, but be guided by, Seaport Plan Policy 4 and guided by the fact that the ultimate we're looking to see on the throughput of the cargo forecast. What you should not really consider is the project itself. This is about removing the port priority use. And, I don't know if that's helpful or not. And if I'm answering your question, and the reason I
think you did. Yeah. And I think it's pretty clear. I think we all understand that our role is not to look at the project, but this issue about future port land for given future cargo needs. Correct.
And I think you need to ask yourself the fundamental question as well, which is, will this lead to bay fill? I mean, I think that's part of it, and that's a big reason we have these rules. So, you get all of the information, you look at it, you weigh it, and you make a decision as a commissioner.
Right. That last point you made, I think, is very important, because when the whole purpose of the formation of BCDC in the 1960s was to protect the bay from bay fill to the maximum extent possible, and there were standards for that. And clearly, protecting port land for future use is important to minimize the risk for additional bay fill. That's right. So the other point I just wanted to ask
John,
yes.
I apologize for interrupting. One thing I would add is that I think in that looking to guidance, AB 1911, the Bonta bill, is also relevant.
Yeah, I understand. So the second question, just for staff to clarify once and for all, I think they have. And in the staff report, it says, section 11003, subdivision B of BCDC regulations specifies the requirements of the staff planning report for a bay planning amendment. Staff planning report shall contain a statement describing the effect the proposed change would have on any existing finding, policy, or map designation contained in the San Francisco Bay Plan and the San Francisco Bay Area Seaport Plan. And then, of course, in the staff report, it also goes into the issue about environmental justice and Bay Plan Policy 1 on environmental justice and equity states the Commission's guiding principles on environmental justice and social equity should shape all of its actions and activities. The Commission, and then goes into it. So just to clarify, I understand there's EJ issues with regard to the project, which is a separate issue. And there's EJ issues over whether land is port priority or not. That's a separate issue. That's what's before us. Just to clarify, environmental justice principles are relevant to a decision of whether to take land out of port priority or not. Nothing to do with the project now. Just taking land out of port priority or not. Will you clarify that point?
Yes, Commissioner Joya, you're correct. They are relevant, but environmental justice principles also are constrained by the MAC Act, in that you obviously cannot elevate environmental justice principles over the MAC Act. But within that framework, that is correct.
If we didn't have this policy, given this policy, and if we couldn't apply it, it would be a meaningless set of words on a piece of paper, right? Oh, okay. And I raise that because I think and one of the findings, finding B, in the environmental justice policy, does recognize that The Commission has approved additional development projects to existing ports, oil and gas operations, sewage and wastewater treatment plants, and heavy industry in or near low-income communities of color around the Bay Area. And that it's facilitated the aggregation of pollution sources within areas designated for port and water-related industry. And I know, having served for many years on the Bay Area Quality Management District and then on the California Air Resources Board that attempts to regulate pollution sources from ports, I think no one can argue that uses at ports or expansion of uses at ports impact, I'm not saying there aren't other impacts with other kinds of projects, but impact surrounding communities, predominantly low-income communities of color. I think that's a given. And a more intense port use at Howard Terminal has environmental justice implications, period. I live near the Port of Richmond. I know what port uses are like. I understand the impact of port uses. Our own community of Richmond does. So I just wanted to make sure that was clarified. The other point that I think, which really does get to, ultimately, this is about what's our judgment in looking at all the evidence that was presented. And I appreciate the staff, yes.
And that will be presented
Yes.
as due to this public hearing and
there'll be more.
the extension
That's right.
through tomorrow and Friday.
That's right. I'll continue to welcome that public comment, public input. And I know the staff in its report is taking, the very important guidance that we only look at available port capacity that is within our jurisdiction. I get that. And saying that, technology changes, the world changes, land use changes over 20, 30 years. And one of the things that struck me is that, so the staff's analysis, given their review under the law, concludes that, makes a conclusion that there would be sufficient port property available, basically. What they didn't consider, which to me is maybe a cushion, is the fact that efficiencies are going to happen. How and where, to what extent, may be debated. Talk to real estate developers who years ago said, we will never build parking structures. They're just too expensive for housing. It knocks out our project. Well, guess what? Those structures are now utilized because of the high cost of land and allow units to be built. I suspect the evidence is showing of what's happening even around the world is that you're going to see, as there's more constrained space on ports and the cost of land, that investment's going to be driven toward those efficiencies. And I know the Port of Oakland itself has said that. In fact, the third largest port on the West Coast has said that. I mean, it's interesting how people criticize the port on some things when they don't agree with it, and then want to agree with them on the things they do agree with. So what they said is, yes, you're going to see these efficiencies. How exactly they play out, and I suspect one area will be using every acre of available port land more efficiently, right? That's going to happen. It's going to cost money. Just like the ports at first didn't want to electrify, do shore power for ships, they're doing it because that's been required for air quality purposes. Second, there is land outside our port jurisdiction, right? Outside of BCDC jurisdiction, like in the Benicia, Antioch, that may be able to accommodate more. That's additional cushion. We just don't consider that as part of the analysis. And the other point that I found interesting is the staff report talks about how RoRo capacity is really based upon not the year-to-year micro changes, but vehicle miles traveled. And I may want to ask staff to explain that further. It said VMT is really the big issue that drives that cargo analysis. Well, guess what? It's the policy of the state of California to reduce greenhouse gases a lot through reduction of vehicle miles traveled. And so in 30 years from now, right, if the state policy is successful and all the changes that are being made, and we get VMTs to lower greenhouse gas emissions, that also indicates some direction. So I don't know if the staff my last comment was, staff just want to explain this whole issue of how VMT drives RoRo cargo analysis. That's what the staff reports. I'd like to understand that more.
Commissioner Joy, I could, oh, sorry, did I interrupt someone?
No, I was saying it's yours to answer.
Yeah,
Okay.
looking at page 63 of the staff report where that's referenced.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think the Tioga Group would probably give you a better answer than I could, or referring to the cargo forecast itself. But you're right that the way that the forecast works is there are different growth projections for each of the three different types of cargo, and they're based on some kind of standardized metrics for how growth might occur. And for RoRo cargo, that metric is vehicle miles traveled, as you're pointing out. But I'm not sure in terms of those future projections, like what was taken into account in terms of some of the state legislation you're talking about, whether that would impact that or not.
Okay, thanks. And my last comment is, I know there was some discussion made about some previous Bay Plan amendments and how that impacts this. I know probably Director Wagenknecht and I are the last two commissioners left who were around with some of those early Bay Plan amendments, and each of those stood on their own. A Bay Plan amendment from 2000, 2003 doesn't bind our hands of what we're doing today. Each Bay Plan amendment must stand on its own.
Thank you. Commissioner Nelson.
It will be quick. First, a process question for folks who are listening. We just closed the public hearing. We're going to have another staff recommendation, a final staff recommendation before our next hearing at the end of the month on this project. And so I just wanted to make sure folks know that means, right, there's going to be another public hearing. I'm swallowing hard.
No, not another public hearing.
So no opportunity for public comment on that next
step? That's a different question.
Okay.
So Greg, do you want to take this?
Yes, I was going to say, of course, there will be public comment on the next hearing. Staff will give their final recommendation, and the public will have an opportunity to comment on that. It's 100% there's going to be public comment at the next meeting. But it's different than this public comment in that staff will not be responding to that public comment because obviously we will be voting at that meeting. And so that's really the difference between today's public comment was an opportunity for the public to give lots of comments, give written comments, and for staff to respond. Whereas at the next meeting, it's purely going to be you speak at it, and then we are going to vote. I hope that was clarifying.
Yeah, two things. That is why the June 30th meeting is also scheduled at 9 a.m. because we anticipate that there will be an awful lot of public comment. And second, you and the public will get the final staff recommendation at some point, not next week, but right around the week after in some way, shape, or form.
Just glad I asked. I thought that it would be helpful to the public listening. One more comment and then a couple of questions for staff. We are moving fast in this process because of the requirement in AB 1191. I simply wanted to note that I see that bill as a real disservice. Imposing that deadline means the staff has been under real pressure to get a draft recommendation out before they had complete information. Puts them in a very difficult position if new information suggests that perhaps they should modify that. It also means the public is commenting before we have information. It also, I think, does a disservice to the applicant because, as Commissioner McGrath pointed out, there's a requirement for a 2/3 vote here. I just wanted to note here that I think that legislation, nothing we can do about that here, but I think that bill does a disservice to all of us at this point. 3 questions for staff, not to respond to now, but things that I hope staff can consider as they're writing a final recommendation. First, I agree with a couple of other folks, Commissioner Hahn and Joya, about making sure that we understand the environmental justice implications of the decision we're going to make at that meeting. That decision is, do we delete the port priority use designation, which necessarily means, almost certainly means, that the ancillary interim uses at the Howard terminal will end. Those are not, if that means those ancillary uses were going to be pushed off of that site, that means they'll push somewhere else. I don't know where else they would go. Don't know the impacts of that decision. Those are the impacts of deleting the port priority use designation, not the impacts of the ballpark or the other facilities developed there. So I think it's really important that we understand those issues. And when we have limited authority to consider those impacts, limited, not none, but limited. But we have the same limit on environmental justice implications on many of the projects that come before us. There are limits on our ability to consider those implications. So I just wanted to make sure I supported my fellow commissioners on that. Second, Commissioner McGrath pointed out that he's concerned about assumptions with regard to efficiency and projections in future efficiency. It struck me looking at the staff report that the Port of Oakland is already the fourth most efficient port on that list. And a number of people said that other ports are looking to pick up land. I don't know if it's possible for staff to get this information by the time that the staff report is final. But if it is true that other ports are looking to pick up land rather than to invest in efficiency, some of those ports are 15, 30% or even more less efficient than the Port of Oakland today. If other ports are looking to invest in land rather than efficiency, I think that would be information that would be useful to have. And then finally, one of the longshoremen speaking today talked about potential conflicts between container facilities, container operations, and this potential new development. But it struck me that the next site to this is not to Howard Terminal, is not a container facility, it's Schnitzer Steel. And I've been by Schnitzer Steel a number of times on the water when it's in operation, and that facility can be loud. So one of the other things that would be helpful to see is the potential for conflicts between whatever the ultimate use, the non-port use on Howard Terminal might be, and Schnitzer Steel, given that it is different from the other container uses on that site.
But isn't that issue, which is an interesting issue, one that would come up when and if a permit came before us as opposed to this?
That's certainly, yes, that is certainly true. It's clearly an implication of deleting, I mean, right now, Schnitzer Steel is buffered by port land on all sides. That would not be the case if we delete that. So we're potentially setting up a conflict if we delete that port priority use designation, and we decide that is a real conflict down the road, we will have crossed the Rubicon on that issue.
No, I'm not sure I agree with that. I would note that a good friend, Tassian Kwamalele, who spoke to us this afternoon, will partly appreciate and partly not appreciate what I'm about to say. Schnitzer Steel provides a very valuable resource to our area. The recycling that it does is tremendously beneficial in getting rid of what would otherwise be accumulated waste all over the place.
Absolutely.
However, I do not believe that it is within our mission at BCDC to consider effects on Schnitzer Steel unless it somehow affected capacity and the potential for fill, which I believe it does not. So you're right. That's the job of the Oakland City Council, potentially the port. I don't think that's our job. But I could be wrong. It wouldn't be the first time in my life. Other questions?
For staff to opine, that's it for me. Thank you.
I don't see any other. Oh, I see Commissioner Eisen. I'm sorry. She would have kicked me.
I really don't want to keep anybody from getting to the Warriors game.
I just want to catch the 6 o'clock ferry back to Richmond. That's what I care about.
Okay.
I think you'll be able to do that.
I am sort of compelled to speak now, even though I know we'll have a lot of discussion on the 30th, in response to Commissioner On's concern about the kind of odd box we're in terms of what we can consider in terms of environmental justice at this stage versus at the permitting stage if we get to that stage. And it occurred to me, because of what Commissioner Joya said about our purpose being to limit fill, that our dual purpose, based on the Next Year Petrus Act, is to also promote public access to the maximum extent possible. And particularly, the staff has recognized in a number of reports that I've reviewed that the lack of public access is itself an environmental justice issue. So when we make our decision, we're comparing two scenarios, leaving it as it is or opening it up to this development. We know that we're opening it up to this development because if that development doesn't occur, it goes back to being port use, right? And that's the deal. So those are the two options we're considering, and even though all the details of public access that the A's may propose, the 18 acres, et cetera, we wouldn't consider at this time. The fact that there would be no additional public access versus that there would be additional public access, that little fact, which is actually a big fact, is something I think we can consider at this point in time, because I think that is an environmental.
I have just a couple of questions that I'm not actually necessarily seeking an answer for now, but I want to get them out there, and I want staff report in some fashion to reflect them. One, I understand and appreciate that we can't really include the potential capacity of Antioch for RoRo because it's out of our jurisdiction and we can't preserve it. But there is really almost no discussion in the staff report of the financial feasibility of improvements at Howard Terminal, which would be necessary to expand its use. My analysis, and I certainly have not spent as many years at it as Commissioner McGrath, but I was a port commissioner once upon a time, so I have a little understanding, is that Howard Terminal is effectively has no real likelihood of serving container operations. Obviously has capacity to serve RoRo and possibly dry goods. But even for RoRo, there would need to be significant improvements. And when we can't consider, well, I don't want to say we can't. I am concerned that by not considering those financial ones, we're not considering all the relevant factors. Second, particularly given the article this morning about the grand jury report on Hunter's Point, talking about the sea level rise that will cause toxic material there to be released. I don't think there's any discussion of that in the staff or the EA, and I will admit I have not looked at that in the city's EIR, on sea level rise of forcing the release of toxic materials that are at Howard Terminal. And again, the cost of addressing that one way or another in order to have capacity for maritime, as opposed to it being addressed through a development, which connects back to the environmental justice issue. So that's a complex issue, but I think it needs to be factored in. I would appreciate in the staff report having some sense of that.